Hello again, fellow audiophiles. I am Wave Theory, and this is the Audeze CRBN2, name stylized CRBN. This is a $5,995 US full-size, open-back, electrostatic headphone. This, I believe, is a loan from Audeze. They have asked nothing in return other than a fair and honest evaluation, which you are about to receive. I don't know how long-term that loan will be. I'm pretty sure it's a loan. I don't believe I will be able to keep it because, one, I was not allowed to keep the first Carbon, and two, it's a $6,000 unit. They are very likely to want it back. I just don't know when. So, you have my pledge to be as open and as honest and as thorough on this product as I am in all of my reviews. The link down below where you can buy this directly from Audeze will be an affiliate link. Will not be an affiliate link, excuse me. However, if I am an affiliate partner with any retailers who sell this headphone, I will put an affiliate link down in the description. If you like what I have to say about this product and you want to help support the channel, please consider using that maybe affiliate link, and I will get a small kickback if you do, and that just helps me keep the channel running. You know what? I'm gonna ask Audeze if I can hang on to this for a while, though, because I have enjoyed listening to this headphone probably more than I have enjoyed listening to any other Audeze, and I just like it generally. I'm pretty excited about this one. It does some things that I have not really heard estats do before, so we need to get into why that is and talk about how the $6,000 price tag, while hefty, is probably worth it, and all of that right on the other side of Shameless Self-Promotion.
Hi, it's me again, 14 months later and a whole foot taller. Now, since Wave Theory liked the first 10,000 subscriber play button I made him, maybe he wants a 25,000 subscriber play button. This can only happen if you subscribe, though. Now, since over 60% of the watch time comes from unsubscribed viewers, I'm gonna need you to subscribe. You can also sign up for his Patreon or send him money in PayPal. Links in the description. Now, on to the video.
As usual, I try to be as thorough as I can be, particularly in my descriptions of sound and how this headphone compares to other headphones in the market, in this case, both electrostatic and not, okay, up in this price range, just so we can evaluate whether or not it is fairly priced for what it is. So we may be here a while, as usual. Use the timestamps to jump around and watch the parts that are of most relevance and interest to you. Otherwise, grab your beverage of your choice, get comfortable, and let's talk about the Audeze CRBN2. So again, just shy of $6,000 US for this, and it is an electrostatic headphone. I have made a video in the past describing what electrostatic headphones are and how they work, so I will not go into those details here. I will just put a link to that video down in the description below. So if you are new to the electrostatic game and you want to know exactly what makes them tick, okay, click on over to that and watch that video here as well. So we will talk about the CRBN2 here and what makes it unique and also where it fits in the headphone market more broadly, again, both in comparison to other estat headphones and to planar magnetic headphones and dynamic driver if they're up there in this price as well. Okay. So, a couple of the unique features here about the CRBN2. First of all, it is the CRBN2. There was a CRBN1, or just the Carbon, no number after that. I've done a couple of videos on the Carbon. I will also put links to that down in the description as well, so you can see what my thoughts were on the first model to bear the Carbon name. This second generation of the Carbon series of electrostatic headsets here does maintain a lot of the features that the first one had, such as carbon nanotube infused a driver membrane in there, for example. It also has the same basic build and shape. If you remember the original Carbon, it looked pretty much identical to this, with the exception of the colorway, where the first Carbon had silver accents. This one has more copper-colored accents in there, which just gives it a slightly different look, although the basic shape of the headphone is the same. And I think the mass of it, or the weight, if you want to call it that, even though it's not physically correct, given how they report it, is about 480 grams, okay, right in there. And it really feels the same on the head. Same clamp force, same fit, all of that kind of stuff. Like all of that is basically identical. Now I am going from memory here. It's been well over a year since I heard the original Carbon. So I can't go into great detail about exact comparisons, but I'm just saying like my experience there, just the way this feels on the head, the way it looks, and having the benefit of being able to go back and watch my own reviews on the original. Okay, the build is pretty much the same. It's just those aesthetic changes with the coloring in there that happens too. Now, this iteration of the Carbon 2 has what Audeze is calling slam technology, which, as I understand it from their website, which I will link to so you can read about this and see if you agree with my interpretation or not, is basically a type of venting in there. Like they are venting the driver, almost kind of creating a ported system, and kind of, it strikes me anyway, as being analogous to a ported speaker box, right, in there, so that it lets out some of the acoustic energy that can build up inside the ear cup when you get a good seal there, and it does it in a way that increases the amount of bass output. And you can kind of see these vents, okay, both on the front here, okay, with these notches that you see right in here, and then also on the back right here. So that is an interesting way to get more bass output from an electrostat, because electrostatic headphones have largely been known to be a bit bass lean, not have super great bass extension, definitely not have a lot of rumble or slam in the low end here. So Audeze seems to have set out to get more bass response, both more in quantity and then like more in dynamics and output and oomph, okay, to the bass output here. And so that slam tech seems to be their solution. And I gotta say, they get some pretty positive results out of that, which we'll get into in the sound section here. All right. Other build things of note that really are the same as the original Carbon is we have about a 2.5 meter long attached cable here, which is round. Okay, a lot of estat headphones of old, and I have the HiFiMan Shangri-La Jr headset here to demonstrate this, but a lot of attached cables on estat headphones prior to this have used these more ribbon-style flat cables like this. Okay, the cable on the Carbon 2 here, and this was the same as on the original Carbon, is more rounded in there. Also, the 5-pin connector here on the amp end is metal. The barrel on it is made out of aluminum, where a lot of estats use a plastic barrel connector here, a molded plastic here on the Energizer end, like so. Okay, but you do see that we have the standard 5-pin connector here. The bias voltage on the Carbon 2 is 580 volts. That is the STAX standard. So that is also the most common electrostat standard out there, because STAX really set that standard. So there are a fair number of electrostatic energizers that are out there that will work with the Carbon 2. If you are new to electrostats, what that bias voltage means is that the membrane on the driver has to carry a constant electric charge on it that comes in at 580 volts. All right, not every estat headphone out there uses that voltage. For example, the Warwick Acoustics Aperio, they're like $38,000 unit or something like that, uses an 1800 volt bias voltage. So the stack of electronics that come with that unit would not be compatible with the Carbon 2, just as one example. But anything that is STAX compatible should work with the Carbon 2, no problem there. Okay, so I mean, in terms of like the build and the fit and the comfort, again, I don't personally feel the need to go over all of that again, since I have done that work previously with the original Carbon, and Audeze does a really good job of describing it all on their website. I will let those two resources do the bulk of the work on that. So let's start talking about the sound of the Carbon 2, and then by extension where it fits into the headphone market at $6,000 US. To start with my sound discussion, as usual, I'll give you an idea of what signal chains I plugged this thing into as test gear. Okay, for me, I would have used all digital music files, so FLAC files that were either lossless or high res, played locally or streamed from Qobuz all through Roon. There also would be some DSD files in there, also played locally. There are no streaming services that offer DSD that I know of. So as I mentioned, I am a Roon user. So there were two primary signal chains that I used to test the Carbon 2 on that have a key similarity in here, which we'll get to here in a moment. So where the two signal chains are different are on the source end. So Roon endpoints that would have been used are either a Sonor Ultra Rendu streamer routed through a Vice Engineering INT204 DDC, and then an AES connection from there into my Berkeley Alpha Series 2 DAC. The other signal chain starts with a Sonor Optical Rendu now as the Optical Rendu Deluxe Edition. Can't spit those words out for some reason. Okay, then direct USB from there into my Lampezator Baltic 3 DAC. Both the Alpha and the Baltic DACs go through an XLR switch and then XLR connection into my LTA Z10E amplifier, which also is an electrostatic energizer with a 580 volt bias voltage. Okay, that LTA is really the only energizer that I used to compare or to listen to the Carbon 2 on. I normally like to use a variety of signal chains to test gear, but when it comes to estats, I just have less gear on hand to be able to do that. So you get one this time, unfortunately. Now, the plus side of that is the Z10E seems to be Audeze's preferred energizer with their Carbon series headsets. Why do I say that? Well, because at both CanJam New York earlier this year and then CanJam SoCal, which happened earlier in the month that I record this video, they demoed this headphone on LTA Z10Es. Okay, you also see the Z10E depicted frequently on their website as being matched to their Carbon estat headsets, and then the Z10E is also in the list of suggested energizers for their Carbon series headsets on their website. Okay, so that tells me that they are pretty comfortable with that combination, so I am pretty comfortable doing a review with that combination as well. Okay, what did I find sonically from this headphone then? As I said earlier, this is probably my favorite Audeze headphone, really of any type. I enjoyed listening to this headphone in a way that I rarely have with Audeze's. Let me state up front here that I think Audeze is a fine headphone maker. They make really good headphones. They just haven't always worked for me. There are some that have, right? Like I own a classic LCD2 pre-phaser. I don't use it a whole lot anymore. It's been surpassed technically by a lot of other headphones that I have, but I just can't part with it. There's like a nostalgia and just an emotional connection to that headphone because it was one of my first planars. It sounded really good. I have hung on to it. Other Audezes I have really liked. Like I thought the open back LCD-X 2021 edition was also really good and quite a value at its price point when it was introduced into the market. And the LCD-5 has long been like one of my, has been like one of the better $4,000+ planar magnetic or just top of the line kind of tier headphones out there that I thought you really got your money's worth with that headphone. I have not always thought that about every 4K plus headphone that is out there. Okay, but beyond that, Audeze's tuning choices have not always worked for me. I mostly have found them to be quite mid-forward, which makes their timbre sound very hollow and vocals sound very shouty and honky to me. On even their models that I do like, that is one of the complaints that I have. Okay, so for me to say that I enjoy this more than any other Audeze I have heard before, hopefully provides some useful context there, or that what I've just shared with you provides useful context to help you understand that statement and what it really means a little bit more. All right, so digging more deeply then on this, let's start with the tuning here. And we're already going to start getting into how the Carbon 2 kind of deviates from the electrostatic sound, which I have some comments to make about that phrase here in a little bit. We'll come back to that. Okay. The 1,000-foot view of the tuning here on the Carbon 2, I would have to call it a mid-centric, but not necessarily mid-forward. It also does successfully bring in a lot more bass energy and impact than most estat headphones have had to this point. Okay. All right, so let's unpack those tuning statements here, and then we'll talk about other technicals. So I call it mid-centric here because the extension, both in the bass and up in the treble, up into the air frequencies, is there, but there is a bit of roll-off to it. So while the bass here is more present and more rumbly and more impactful than just about any other estat I have had meaningful time with to this point, there is still a bit of a roll-off that starts around 40 or 50 hertz or so. So there's not super deep linear bass extension there. There still is a bit of a roll-off. Likewise, up at the upper ranges of the frequency spectrum into the air frequencies above 10K, there is also perceptibly a bit of a roll-off again up there. So there is some air, but it does roll off a bit. So the net effect of that is that the mid-range range is the thing that really stands out and grabs the attention the most to my ears anyway here. Yes, the bass is impressive, and we're going to get to that in more detail here in a bit. That's the thing I expected to stand out to me the most, the bass, but what really stood out to me the most here was the mid-range. And I say that it is mid-centric and not mid-forward because by and large, it avoids a lot of the pitfalls that my ears have picked up with Audeze headphones in the past. Namely, it is very rarely ever hollow in timbre. It is very rarely ever shouty or honky with vocals and that sort of thing. I say rarely because it's not never. One of my nitpicks with this headphone is that on occasion with some recordings and with some vocalists, there is just a little bit too much mid-range energy yet where it can get into kind of a hollow timbre and a shouty, honky vocal delivery. But again, they are the exceptions, not the rules, as they have been with Audezes of the past for me, at least most Audezes of the past. Okay, now, some people are going to like that, and this is going to be music to your ears, punfully intended, okay? And the reason for that is, like, I tend to be a bit mid-range sensitive, if not just straight up intolerant, okay? Probably a little of both. In that I am very prone to perceiving hollow timbre, shoutiness, and honkiness through the mids. So again, I have a sensitivity and an intolerance there that for me, like say the HiFiMan house sound, which many people consider to be recessed through the mids, sounds just about right to me. Okay, this might be just a touch forward a little bit. Now, that said, the tonal balance is excellent here through the mids. The relationship between fundamental frequencies and harmonics are pretty spot on more often than they are not. Okay, so if you are in the camp where something like the HiFiMan house sound or the Sennheiser HD800 series, as two examples, are too recessed in the mids for you, but you have also found other Audezes maybe to be a bit too far forward, this one strikes a really nice middle ground to my ears there. Okay, so vocals do have a nice presence and weight to them here. There is a nice fullness to vocal sounds on this headphone there and all that. Now, brass instruments can be a little bit much for me on this one, more so than with a lot of other headphones there, but less so than most Audezes again. So that's one of those areas where just that kind of mid-centric presentation and maybe just a hair too much presence for me. Again, like brass instruments can get a little bit overwhelming, can be a little bit glaring and kind of collapse soundstage for me a little bit. Not all the time, but it happens more on this than it does with, say, the Susvara series, just as an example. Okay. So that's a lot about the mids. Let's get back to that bass, because that I think that's the big draw to this headphone. Yes, from about 50-ish hertz up through the rest of the bass range of the frequency spectrum, there is really excellent presence, rumble, slam. Okay, this has a much warmer and bassier sound to it than most estats do. I mean, bar none. The only estat that I could say might challenge this would be the Dan Clark Carina, which I have only heard at Can Jam shows just to kind of get a taste of it. So I've not had a full evaluation period with that one as I have with this one. Hopefully that'll happen soon. But my first impression with that is that's the only other estat out there right now that will challenge the CRBN2 here for just raw bass presence. Okay, so that is an achievement there as well. Now, the bass, again, it is potent. There is good punch to it. Maybe not necessarily slam, because it doesn't quite have the weight and the heft below 50 hertz that really kind of gives you a good sense of slam. At least gives me a good sense of slam. But it does have some good punch, some good impact in there up there. So kick drums have a nice satisfying punch to them. Likewise, the attack on aggressive bass guitar string plucks, okay, also comes across with some impact and out there. Now, is it a head slammer, universally speaking? Is it the bass cannon that someone who is like for example, the LCD5 for example has excellent bass impact? Is this up there on that level? No, it is not. Okay, it is probably in the range of average punch and impact on headphones universally of any type, but it is definitely way above average in those traits for estat headphones. Okay, so that is quite a remarkable achievement there, both in terms of the presence and the impact. However, the pitch definition, the articulation, the texturing in the low end, fantastic. Okay, those are all excellent here. And those have been strengths of the estat sound that have made it in here as well. So then I've already talked about like the roll off in the treble then as we turn our attention to the upper frequencies here. There is that roll off in the air, but down in more of like where most music lives, like cymbal crashes sound excellent on this headphone. Really amazing, like reference level tonal balance on cymbal crashes where the relationship between fundamental frequencies and their harmonics are just spot on. The treble is very smooth, very well resolved and textured here. It just sounds very natural. Great timbre, not fatiguing, only ever being sharp and sibilant when the recording is sharp and sibilant, which sounds like a cliche, but it is true here. Okay, so that part, really good. Okay, so the overall tone and tuning on this headphone is strong, mid-centric, with roll-offs at the extremes at either end, but definitely more bass presence and impact than just about any other estat I have heard, with the exception of maybe the Dan Clark Carina, which I can't go into more details on right now. Okay, what about the other technical aspects of the sound? This is where we also need to talk about, like, what is that estat sound, right? And I use air quotes here intentionally. Electrostatic headphones have a reputation of being bass lean, being very detailed and resolving, perhaps to the point of being a bit detail forward, but also being quite dry in their presentation. Some of these traits are well earned, right? Most estats that are out there are bass lean, okay? And as I have already said, the CRBN2 addresses a lot of that successfully to a large degree. Okay, a lot of estats out there are incredibly resolving, very, very fast sounding there with lots of detail retrieval to the point of coming across as detail forward sometimes. The CRBN2 here is very fast, it is very detailed, it is very resolving, it has a well-textured sound, and all of that too, but it is not in your face about it, at least not to my ears here. There is a nice balance here on the detail presentation. To me, the detail retrieval and the presentation of those details does not come across as being either in your face or too laid back. A very nice natural balance is struck there, in my opinion. Okay, so a lot of estats out there do push the details at you, and they're like, listen to me, I'm resolving. That's my interpretation. Your mileage may vary. This one, all of the details, all of the resolution that you would expect for $6,000 unit seem to be there. It's just in a more natural, not in your face presentation, but again, not lacking. Okay, not too laid back. All right. The other aspect that I mentioned in there is that a lot of estats have a reputation for being dry. What does that mean, for example? Okay, dryness in sound generally happens when the decays of tones is a little bit quick, okay? So every tone of a sound that we hear has a leading edge, like the wave front that's coming at you, the very first compression that starts to hit your eardrum there. That's called the attack, okay? Then, of course, you have the trailing end of that tone, which is on the other side of the attack, okay? That's called the decay. If a headphone, well, any driver, could be a speaker driver too, if the transducer returns to rest quickly, very quickly, then you can have like a short or maybe truncated at times decay. When the decays are a little bit on the short side, perhaps a little bit on the truncated side, we call that sound dry. Because what happens is that the trailing edge of a lead tone stops, and then there might be a little bit of a gap before the attack of the next tone comes in. When there is space between a subsequent decay and a following attack, that can come across as what we have determined dry. Estat drivers have typically been very, very fast. They are very quick on that decay, which helps them be fast, right? When a driver returns to rest very quickly, that is a very well-controlled, responsive driver. And the more well-controlled and responsive that a driver is, generally the more resolving it can be, because the more effectively it will respond in response to the incoming electromagnetic signal, which is the sound wave in electromagnetic form. Okay. The CRBN2 here is not as dry sounding. It is still fast, it is still resolving, it is still detailed. But to me, it did not have kind of that stereotypical estat dryness. But it is, again, well balanced. It does not sound wet to me either. So, what I just described is dry. What wet would mean is like a decay that lingers a bit too long, right? So that the decay of a leading tone kind of bleeds and blends into the attack of a following tone. Okay, too much of that can sound wet. Generally speaking, most listeners don't like either a too dry or a too wet sound. We like it right down the middle. We want a balance in between there. Now, all of us listeners are going to disagree on what that proper balance is, and that's fine. Okay, I'm here to tell you that I think the balance on the wet-dry spectrum of the Carbon 2 is very good. Quite natural to my ears, actually, which kind of helps with its overall, like, natural timbre and presentation there. Okay, it is definitely less dry sounding to my ears than most estats that I have heard. Okay, it is similar in its wet/dryness to my ears of, like, say, the HiFiMan Susvara, okay, which is a planar magnetic headphone. We'll get to more comparisons with that here in a little bit, but I think its decay timing is very similar to what the Susvara presents. And I really like the Susvara. A lot of people do, so I think that's good company to be in. Okay, so that's one example there. Okay, spatial presentation. Excellent holography here. A very three-dimensional presentation to it. The LCD5, one of the things that stood out to me about the LCD5 was how well balanced it was in the three spatial dimensions. It just really had a natural three-dimensionality to its soundstage presentation. The Carbon 2, by and large, is very similar in that way. Very well balanced in the three spatial dimensions, width, depth, height, okay, there, that it sounds quite three-dimensional and holographic. It also has a in the presentation kind of stage to it, which is very much an Audeze trait. Okay, what does that mean? If you go to a symphony presentation, okay, the HiFiMan house sound, things like the Sennheiser HD800 series, okay, those kinds of things, they are a little bit more speaker-like. Meze does this too. The Meze Elite, the Empyrean series, for example. The soundstage presentation is more out in front, kind of speaker-like. So if you're at that symphony performance, like I talked about, you're kind of back in the audience seating, and you hear all of the instruments up on the stage. The Audeze house sound, and Focals kind of do this too, but what the Carbon 2 is like, because it is an Audeze, is it puts you up on the maestro stand. Okay, so you are in the music, right? And it's all around you in this U-shape around you kind of thing. That's kind of what the spatial presentation is like here to my ears. That's neither good nor bad. That's just how I hear it, and I'm trying to communicate what I think this sounds like. Now, the soundstage size on this headphone is a little on the smaller side, and that was the biggest surprise to me probably about this headphone here, is that it is a more intimate presentation in terms of space. Soundstage size on the intimate side, it is one of the smaller staging headphones of any type that I have heard. This is not necessarily a problem. Okay, this is not a criticism or a complaint, just a statement of what I am hearing. Your mileage may vary on whether or not that's good or bad. For me, I like bigger presentations in the soundstage, but I could still listen to this just fine and enjoy it quite a lot, which I did, as I've already stated. Okay, so that's something to be aware of there. Now, that said, that excellent three-dimensionality and the accuracy of imaging and separation and all of that in the sound is also very good, very lifelike to it. Sometimes the spatial separation can be a little bit harder to hear and notice because the overall size of the stage is a little bit on the intimate side. So it just kind of compresses everything down a little bit spatially. So the finer details of, like, the actual size of a sonic image, the space around it, are not quite as noticeable as they are on a larger staging presentation. But if you listen, they are very much still there. Okay, so there is a lot of it right there, right? I mean, the tuning on this headphone is excellent. Okay, you know, it's got that mid-centric presentation, but still much more bass presence and impact than just about any other estat out there. Excellent three-dimensionality and holography to the sounds, to the spatial presentation, although it is on the intimate side. Excellent detail retrieval, excellent resolution, and an attack and decay timing that kind of goes right down the middle, very well balanced there, being not as dry as most other estats, but then also not going into wet territory either, just being very well balanced down the middle there. Okay, so with this headphone, you really do kind of get some of the best qualities of multiple worlds here. You get a lot of the estat traits, the resolution, the speediness of it, the quickness, the low distortion, okay, those kinds of things. But then Audeze has successfully given us more bass, okay, more presence in the low end and so forth on that, and has managed to avoid what many consider to be the weaknesses of the estat presentation. Okay, now just a quick thought that I want to drop here. When I say the estat sound, I think we do need to be careful that and aware that we might be doing some conflation on that. When you hear electrostatic headphone, just be honest with yourself for a minute. When you hear electrostatic headphone, what name comes to mind? It was STAX, wasn't it? That's the first thing that you thought of, okay? STAX is a Japanese company. The more I have gotten into this hobby and in this reviewing, and then also just spoken to the makers and the retailers and the designers and just the people who work in this audio field here, the clearer it has become that there is a Japanese tuning. And the Japanese tuning is a little bit more mid-centric, it is a little bit brighter, it is bass lean, it's kind of fast, and it is detail forward. That's the STAX sound, right? Okay, so is there really truly an estat sound? Or because STAX has dominated the electrostatic headphone market, have we just let that STAX house sound define what estat sound means? I'm not going to answer that question right now, but I'm just going to throw that out for consideration, with also the statement that the Carbon 2 here is an estat that is challenging the notion of there being an estat sound. Okay? Just something to think about and consider out there. Okay. So then, does the Carbon 2 fit into the market here? The comparison with the Carbon 1, the original Carbon, I can't do direct side by side. Now, the Carbon 2 is $1,500 more expensive than the original Carbon, which I believe was $4,500. There are some similarities, like the original Carbon was going in the right direction of giving us more bass, right? The Carbon 2 is the next step along that process where it gives you even more bass presence. Yet, I'm going from memory here. Audeze also presents measurements on their website that show that, so I don't think that I'm remembering that wrong. The thing that stood out to me about the original Carbon was that, much like a lot of other Audezes, there was too much mid-range for my ears in there. It was too mid-forward, hollow timbre, shouty honky vocals, that kind of thing. And as I've already said here, I am not picking that up with this headphone. I think that the Carbon 2 is much more tonally balanced and much more tonally even through the whole 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz frequency spectrum than the original Carbon was. So I much prefer the Carbon 2 to the original Carbon. Resolution, detail retrieval, holography, and all that, I remember being very good on the original Carbon as well. I cannot say how much better the Carbon 2 is directly, because again, I was unable to hear them right side by side with each other. I suspect that the 2 is a slight upgrade from the original, but then again, that is just a suspicion, a hypothesis. I cannot confirm that. Okay, the other estat that I have on hand here to do a comparison with, as I've already mentioned, is the HiFiMan Shangri-La Jr, which I believe if you buy just the headset is like $4,500, maybe $5,000 USD now. If you buy it with its matching Energizer, it's an $8,000 combo. You can definitely hear the HiFiMan house sound through the Shang Jr here in that it is bigger. It is more spacious in its sound presentation. It is definitely brighter. okay, in there too. And then it also just kind of has that mid-range, some call it recess in there, and so forth in there. So, I mean, definitely tuning differences between these two. The Carbon 2 gives you more rumble, starting at about 50-ish hertz and all that. It gives you more bass presence than the Shang Jr. does, for sure, all that. The Shang Jr. here is also a little bit on the dry side in comparison to the Carbon 2 here. So, like, there's some dryness in the presentation here on the Shangri-La Jr. that the Carbon 2 takes a step forward with. The Carbon 2 has a more natural treble timbre to it. Cymbals sound better to me. There is a bit of a grain to the sound on the Shang Jr., very mildly so in comparison to what the Carbon 2 does too. So there's more smoothness and refinement to the Carbon 2's presentation than there is on the Shangri-La Jr. here as well. The Junior, though, I do prefer its take on the mid-range tuning mildly. Just it's got that HiFiMan mid-range tuning for it, which just works better for my ears there. So vocals just sound a little bit more realistic to me. They are thinner on the Shangri-La Jr. than they are on the Carbon 2, but they just sound a little bit more natural and realistic to my ears, just because the mid-centricness of the Carbon 2 throws off just a hair. Just a hair. Not big differences here. Definitely not deal-breaking for me on the Carbon 2. Just what I heard there. And that kind of extends to, I'll bring it over here, to the HiFiMan Susvara here, the original, which, because it is a $6,000 headphone, that's a pretty direct comparison here price-wise between these two. And the nice thing about the LTA Z10E is that it drives standard headphones too. It's not just an estat energizer, it pushes the Susvara pretty well. So I was able to compare these two from the same amplifier here as well. So this was a very interesting comparison, and this was a case where basically it came down to, I think they're basically technical equals. They just have different presentations, okay? Different strengths. I will say different relative strengths, different relative weaknesses, because the list of weaknesses for either headphone here is tiny, okay? All right, so digging into that a little bit more then, the Susvara gives you better bass extension. Like, it will go pretty linear extension all the way down to 20 hertz into the subsonic range, which gives its low-end presentation more overall weight and heft to it. So while on a frequency response graph, which I haven't seen the comparison here to know for sure, it would not shock me if the Carbon 2 has a little bit more presence in the bass from around 50-ish hertz up to whenever the bass range blends into the mid-range. Okay, but the Susvara still has a little bit more rumble to it. It just sounds a little bit bassier because of that extra extension that it has that the Carbon 2 does not. So something like Why So Serious from Hans Zimmer rumbles so much more on the Susvara than it does on the Carbon 2. The Carbon 2 still does have a hefty amount of rumble there, but some of the fundamentals in that passage from Why So Serious that are like a bass acid test are below or into the range where the sub bass on the Carbon 2 is rolling off, and it's not on the Sus there. So that is one difference. Now, in terms of pitch definition, articulation, bass texturing, all of that kind of stuff, they are pretty much each other's equal in the frequency ranges where they are both comfortable operating there. Okay, the Susvara on the right amp will slam harder than the Carbon 2 does as well. The Susvara is not known as a head slammer generally. There are amps out there, though, that can make it a brute, okay? And so maybe there is an estat energizer out there that will make the Carbon 2 a bass brute as well, possibly. My Z10E is not that. The Z10E gives the low end on the Susvara, some pretty good, fun, impactful low end on it. And the Carbon 2 was just not quite there even on the Z10E. Not far behind, but definitely advantage Susvara there. I prefer the Susvara's spatial presentation over the Carbon 2. The Susvara gives you a much bigger soundstage. The three-dimensionality of the sound stages, the holography of the presentations, the accuracy of the imaging and the separation, again, about even, okay? At least on the gear that I had to test there. It's just that the Susvara is bigger in stage, so that does make it a little bit easier to pick out the separation, the spatial separation, okay? But that's about the only real difference there, so it's just going to be a preference thing there for you. I preferred the mid-range tone and timbre on the Susvara. Vocals, again, sounded more natural to me, more realistic, okay? They had an appropriate and natural weight to them, where they sounded just a little bit too full and thick and weighty to me on the Carbon 2, with just a hint of mid-forwardness in comparison to the Susvara. So while vocals, both male and female, and while instrument timbre from like pianos and strings and acoustic guitars and horns and drums and all of that kind of stuff sounded very good and natural on both of these headphones, I just had a slight preference for the Susvara, thinking it was just a little bit more natural through that range. However, cymbals, but treble timbre and tone is better on the Carbon 2 than it is on the Susvara to my ears there. Cymbal crashes were just a little bit more natural and tonally balanced to my ears, okay, than on the Carbon 2 than they were on the Susvara. And so over very long listening times, there could be a little bit less fatigue there, although the Susvara is rarely ever fatiguing for me, okay? But just some compare and contrast there with the Susvara. But then again, like we're talking about the whole package there, kind of trading blows in what they're good at and that sort of thing, does tell me that $6,000 for the Carbon 2 is absolutely appropriate. It is performing at a Susvara-like level, which has defined what a $6,000 headphone should sound like for years now, and that's where the Carbon 2 is fitting in there quite comfortably on the gear that I had to test with, okay? All right. What about the STAX SR-X9000, which is, again, I think also about a $6,000 estat there. I did not have them to compare right side by side, so keep that caveat in mind there. I am unsure if the resolution and detail retrieval on the SR-X9000 is actually better than what the Carbon 2 presents, or if it's just that, like most STAX headphones, it's a little bit more forward in the presentation on the X9000 than it is on the Carbon 2. I cannot say. If I were a betting man, I would say that the SR-X9000 might be just a hair more resolving than the Carbon 2, because I found it to be a hair more resolving, I think, than even the Susvara, which is amazing in resolution already. Okay, but this is right there. But the Carbon 2 is going to give you more bass, more impactful bass. It's going to give you a less detail-forward presentation, a more realistic and natural detail presentation to it. It's not going to be as dry. The SR-X9000 definitely has a bit more of a dry sound, okay? And that sort of thing there. So I also just enjoyed the Carbon 2 in a way that I didn't with the SR-X9000. The SR-X9000, every time I listened to it, I was impressed by it. I was like, this is amazing. But I didn't really love it. It just didn't work for me. The Carbon 2 is something I genuinely enjoy listening to. So that's some thoughts there. And I'm getting long now, okay? I hope I've gotten the point across that the Carbon 2 really is an amazing headphone. It is a remarkable achievement. It is challenging the notion of that estat sound in there in some positive ways. Definitely more bass impact, okay, to go on in there. It is not nearly as dry as a lot of estats that are out there, okay, and so forth. So it is definitely challenging that estat sound. And again, I enjoy listening to the Carbon 2 in a way that I have not enjoyed listening to most other estats and most other Audezes. So I like it. I hope Audeze lets me hang on to it for at least a little while until I can get a Dan Clark Carina in here for comparison. I will ask them if I can do that. I don't know what their answer will be, but regardless of their answer, because they haven't given it yet, there's my take. Really excellent overall headphone, challenging the estat sound. It is a little bit mid-centric in there, and it is a little bit more on the intimate side in its spatial presentation, which may or may not be for you. But with all of that out of the way, thanks for watching. I am Wave Theory. Please remember to like, subscribe, comment. Check out my PayPal and my Patreon. I also offer YouTube channel memberships now. Consider joining those, and on certain tiers, you get to talk to me on Discord. You get my reviews early, and I'm also working on getting some member-exclusive content out there. So stand by for that in the near future. As always, enjoy the music.